Very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, Luisa and Conchita, for this very kind invitation. It's a great honor for me, although I find the setup of your meeting a bit challenging, having first a nice lunch and then dimming the lights and getting people ready for their siesta. It reminds me of my days when I was still a professor in Morocco, my country, my home country, before joining the bank. One afternoon like that, one of my students fell asleep, and which happens to many academics once in a while. But the worst thing was that he was snoring quite loudly. So I discreetly pointed to his neighbor and said, "Can you please wake him up?" And his neighbor said, "No, professor, you put him asleep, you wake him up." What I wanted to do at the beginning, I would like you to look at this young girl, Maria. She's 6 years old. She belongs to the Roma community in Romania, and she lives in the rural area. She has 4 brothers and sisters, and her mother is an illiterate widow who earns no more than 120 euros a month as a seasonal agricultural worker. What do you think are Maria's chances of becoming a prominent lawyer or university professor? Not very high, and certainly much lower than those of a 6-year-old non-Roma boy growing up in Bucharest, the capital city, with 2 parents at home, both with a secondary education and a good income, and only 1 sibling. Many among the 4 million Roma children in Europe, like Maria, attend segregated schools and face difficult odds of achieving economic and social success. Equality of opportunity is about giving Maria and all other children in developing countries the same chance to be successful in life. I wanted to illustrate with this quote what it can mean when we talk about equality and opportunities beyond high school. And for that purpose, I have divided my presentation into 3 parts. First, I want to discuss with you why equity matters in higher education. Second, look at the determinants of inequality, and then look at some promising avenues to overcome inequality in higher education. If we look at the statistics, we see that all over the world, enrollment in higher education has increased very rapidly, as you can see from the statistics. So we could safely assume that it means that there are more opportunities for everyone. But it's more complex than that, and we can observe that in spite of this rapid enrollment growth, we see that tertiary education is still very elitist. And we see strong disparities, not only in access, but also completion, success, in all rich countries, middle-income countries, and low-income countries. And let me illustrate that with statistics from a country that is widely considered as quite successful, Chile, now a member of the OECD. So between 1990 and 2011, in 22 decades, we see a phenomenal growth of higher education, more than doubling the enrollment rate. But when we look at the various income quintiles, we see a slightly different picture. You can see, so we have the poorest on the left, quintile 1, and to the richest on the right, quintile 5. And in both cases, enrollment has increased. So this is good, the good news. But the bad news is that the gap between the poorest and the richest has not decreased, on the opposite, on the contrary. And since I mentioned Romania, we see the same pattern. You know, this was a socialist country. You would expect much more equality, but look at again, if we look at growth between 2002 and 2009, we see the same pattern. The wealthiest have more success than the poorest groups. Now, why is it so important to have equity? For two reasons. We have social and economic reasons. First, there is a strong social justice argument. You may have read the day before yesterday that the 62 richest people on planet Earth have as much wealth as 3.5 billion poorest people in our planet. I mean, these numbers are just staggering. So this is fundamentally unjust. And of course, that may create political instability in many parts of the world, as this poster illustrates. One day the poor will have nothing left but to eat the rich. And you may remember in the part of the world I come from, the Arab world, one of the major reasons for the unrest and the so-called Arab Spring had to do with graduates not finding jobs or young people not finding a school. But even beyond the social justice argument, there is a very strong efficiency economic argument because of the risk of loss of talent. Many among the kids who don't go to school or don't reach higher education may be not so stupid after all. I mentioned the Roma children. The UNDP made a study a few years back looking at the loss in productivity and as a result the loss in taxes in hundreds of millions of euros every year because of these potential contributors to the economy who don't reach tertiary education and don't graduate and cannot work. And you know, again, we have to remember that many people who don't make it have lots of talent. And I want to illustrate that with a comparison between two Nobel Prize winners, chemistry or almost. You may have heard about Lord Rutherford, who was a distinguished physicist and chemist. He was born in rural New Zealand, very bright at school, and then he applied for a scholarship to go to study in the UK. And he didn't get it. But then luck struck. And the first student who was number one in the list who got it, got sick. And so Rutherford got it. And then he went on to win the chemistry Nobel Prize in 1908. And now I want to talk about Chris Lainge, who is considered to be the most intelligent man in the US today as far as IQ measure is concerned. You may have read about it if you read Malcolm Gladwell's Outlier book. Fascinating story. This Chris grows up in a family without a father. He has 4 siblings. The 5 of them don't know their father, and each time it's been a different father. They grow hungry. He makes it to high school, not interested. His teachers are not interested in him. And then he gets a scholarship to go, 2 scholarships. He can choose University of Michigan, very prestigious university, University of Nebraska, not so prestigious. He does not have a clue, so he goes to Nebraska. Why not? And he goes first year, and then he drops out because his mom forgot to fill in the form to get a scholarship renewed the next year. And then he disappears. And one day, you know these programs, I don't know if you have them in Europe, if you want to be a millionaire, he wins all the prizes. He knows everything. He's a walking encyclopedia. And they realized, they tested him, so he's self-learned. You know, he doesn't have a proper job, he didn't finish a degree, but he knows so much because he has a thirst for knowledge. On average, a Harvard graduate student has an IQ of 115. Einstein had an IQ of 150. Chris Lainge has an IQ of 195. But nobody realized that until it was too late. So I want you to use that to illustrate the loss of talent. My premise in this work, and I'm trying to share with you the results of some work I did when I was still at the World Bank on equity. It's about providing equal opportunities for access and success in tertiary education and making sure that people would not be denied the opportunity to study for reasons that have nothing to do with their academic ability. And when we talk about equity, what are we talking about? I've identified 4 groups, what I call the equity groups. First one, of course, is low-income people. You don't want money to be a barrier to education. And then gender. Now, the good news is that all over the world, even the countries that were most regressive towards women, enrollment in higher education is pretty much equal for both men and women. In fact, in many cases today, we have a problem of, the gender problem is a problem of access for boys. But we need to go beyond access. So what kind of institutions do girls go to? And that's where we see a heavy bias in favor of the non-university, the less prestigious institutions in any country. Here I show you some statistics from Peru, the gender distribution. So we have the more prestigious universities, and this is the enrollment rate for males in green, females in blue. So you have, more males, but then if you go to the second-rate technical institutes, it's the opposite. And even more striking statistics from India, where the top prestigious institutions, very high, the most competitive institution in the world are the Indian Institutes of Technology. So look, in universities we have almost parity, 55% boys, 44% girls. But in the IITs, it's almost only boys. And also we should look at disciplines. As you know, in many countries, again, there is, girls are told from beginning, you're going to go and play with your doll, and if you have a boy, you go and play with your Meccano or your Lego, and so you start preparing them for being categorized in typically male or female professions. And last but not least, leadership positions. Again, we see all over the world that you will find very few deans who are lady deans or lady rectors or vice chancellor or university president. Here are statistics for Europe, for example. With the exception of Sweden and Finland, I don't have statistics for Denmark, I'm sure it would be the same pattern, but we don't even have parity even in the most advanced countries. And look, Spain 10%, Switzerland 7%, Italy 7%, Czech Republic, former socialist country, only 5%. Third group, minorities. And depending on the country, it can be ethnic, language, religion, culture, etc. Just to give you statistics about Roma children in Romania. On average, in any age group, 64% of the general population will graduate from high school and almost 30% from tertiary education. But if you are a Roma kid, as a proportion of your age cohort, only 7% will graduate from high school and less than 1% from higher education in Europe. And the last group is what is often referred to as the invisible minority, people with disabilities or special needs. A rich country like France, we receive that only 7% of the universities have accommodation, have a system to deal with students with ability and with disability. And they are very able. This is a graduation ceremony at McGill University in Montreal last year. And many students need, and some universities need accommodation, special accommodation, and some universities are organized properly, but not enough. And we have to be very careful because we sometimes have a biased view of disability. And I love the following picture which I took in a university in Colombia because we have here 2 disabled students. But when they work together as a team, the girl in the wheelchair is the eyes of the blind boy, and the blind boy is pushing the wheelchair. So what are the determinants of inequality? Well, it all starts before higher education. To a large extent, inequality in higher education is the result of what happens, or rather what doesn't happen, in primary and secondary education, where we see barriers that have to do with income, ethnic groups, gender, language, etc. A friend of mine, well, who was at the seminar, Bruce Chapman, a leading student loan expert from Australia, jokingly said this, but in fact he's true. You know, the best way to fight inequality, make sure to choose your parents' rights, because it starts at home. In the US, studies have shown that by age 3, a kid in a rich family has heard 30 million words mentioned more than a kid in a poor family. By age 4, there is already an 18-month academic gap between the two children. This is a real picture of the brains of 2 to 3-year-olds. On the left, kids with a normal development in a normal family. On the right, a kid that has had sensory deprivement. It's not undernourished, it's just not well cared for. And you can see that there is a physical effect and the vortex, where the ability of the cells to develop and neuron connection to be made. And as this cartoon also reflects it, you know, we have strong inequality, which will affect the social and academic capital of children. It goes in cycles, Junior. Sometimes the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And sometimes the rich get richer and the poor stay the same. Now, when you get to higher education, it gets worse because you have additional barriers of two kinds. Money, of course, but also important non-financial barriers. So the money part, in theory, could be easy to deal with. You know, you may remember these pictures from Chile. Chile is the only country in Latin America that charges fees in its public university. So this young lady was the student leader, Camila, and she asks for free higher education. Today she's in Parliament, head of the Education Commission, and the new president, Bachelet, when she was re-elected in December, a main pillar of her platform was to eliminate fees totally. Now, so the assumption is that, you know, if it's free, it's going to be much fairer, it's going to be much easier. And I want to make the point that it's true that it's better if it's free, and especially if you can afford it, if you are a rich country like Luxembourg, like Finland, Sweden, or Switzerland. But most countries in the world cannot necessarily afford it, and it's a little bit more complex than just having free higher education. Let me show you statistics from 3 Latin American countries. This is the enrollment rate and the evolution of the enrollment rate over 20 years. So Argentina, free access and free education. Brazil, restricted access, selective access, but free public higher education. Chile, restricted access and expensive higher education. And yet, who is doing better? Chile, right? And the reason is that even though students have to pay fees, there is a very comprehensive system of scholarships and student loans for low-income students, which doesn't exist either in Argentina or in Brazil. And if we look at enrollment by quintile, again, the paradox is that Chile, which charges fees, has more poor children than the other 2 countries. And Brazil is really a bad case. And if we look at Brazil to try to understand what happens, is that, as I mentioned, it's selective access. So University of Sao Paulo, the country's best public university, 84% of the candidates come from public high schools. Only 16% come from private high schools. And yet, Who gets in? 70% come from the private high school. So you have these rich kids whose parents paid for high school. They are better prepared for the entrance exam, and then they benefit from free higher education, subsidized by society as a whole. Ecuador, another interesting example. They used to have fees, $800 per average, then President Correa becomes president. He abolishes fees in 2007. But who benefits? We see that inequality increases. Of course, it helped a little bit the poor, but it helped much more middle class and the richer part. Canada is also another fascinating example because it's like a lab, because you have each province defining its own policy. So if we look at the average undergraduate fees, Quebec is much cheaper than Ontario. So shouldn't we expect that inequality is less in Quebec? Well, it's the reverse. Inequality is much less in Ontario. Again, for the same reason, because they have, even though it's more expensive, they have a good system of scholarships for the poor students. And recent statistics from the UK show a similar trend. As you know, in 2012, there was a hike in the fees to £9,000. So a lot of worry about the impact on low-income students. And if we compare, if we look by quintile, so this is the richest quintile, the poorest, sorry. These are the poorest, these are the richest. Who is growing faster? The poorest. Same thing when we compare England, where there are fees, Wales, and Scotland, where they don't pay fees. But higher growth. Again, because at the same time as they hike the fees, they have the universal income contingent student loan system put in place. Just one last illustration from Madagascar. I visited the worst student dorm that I've ever seen in my life. I mean, there are dozens of students in these rooms, horrible. But when you get out of the building, this is the picture you see. And these cars belong to the same students. Why? Because they don't pay hardly anything for their accommodation. It's not good quality, it's horrible, but it's free. Plus, those of you who may have worked in African countries, you may remember that in especially the Francophone countries, a big headache for a university rector is to deal with the student restaurant, cafeteria. Headaches because always strikes. I remember visiting the University of Dakar and they were on strike. Why? They were fed up of getting mango as dessert. They wanted oranges from Morocco, from my country. So to avoid this headache, the government in Madagascar decided that they would not feed the students anymore. They had to cook for themselves, and as a result, they would have free electricity. Today, half of the budget of higher education in Madagascar goes to the electricity bill. So regularly, the ministry doesn't have money to pay the electricity company, so they cut off the electricity, and the students go in the street and riots to put pressure to. Now I want to finish with a quote from a distinguished economist trying to summarize this dimension of the financing of higher education. If in some states of the United States higher education institutions are also free, that only means, in fact, defraying the cost of education of the upper classes from the general tax receipts. I know we have several brilliant economists here. Can anybody guess who is the author of this quote? No? Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Now, it's not only about money. As I mentioned earlier, there are important non-financial barriers, including inadequate information, motivation, and academic preparation and social capital. If we look at academic preparation, for example, this is an important factor, and I've already mentioned the case of Brazil. I mean, we assume that because we have a meritocratic mechanism to access higher education, that is fair. But everybody competes on the same questions, so that's very fair, isn't it? It's transparent, it's objective, In some countries, it avoids corruption, as in the former socialists, but it's more complicated than that. Let me show you a visual representation of the city of Santiago, the capital of Chile. The red dots, so this is the city, and the red dots show the students who enter University of Santiago de Chile, which is a middle-range public university. And the red dots show from which high school do they come from, which part of the city. What can you see? It's pretty well distributed, right? Now we move to the University of Chile, which is the top public university in that country. Remember that picture? What do you see? Some degree of concentration here and here, right? Now we're going to move to the Catholic University of Chile, private top university in the country, one of the best in Latin America. Now can anybody guess whether this is the poorest areas or the richest area? Huh? So when you compete, it's not necessary on equal footing. And let me try to illustrate with this cartoon. You know, I'm being very fair. I'm asking all my students to do the same simple exercise, climb on a tree. But it's not fair, right? Because some of us are not well prepared for that. And that's what happens. If you are well prepared at home, if you go to a good primary school, good secondary school, you will rush through the entrance exam. But for many students from underprivileged groups, it will be much more difficult. And then there is this issue of motivation. Now I want to illustrate that with a case study from India. As you know, India is a very rigid, caste-organized society. This is a test which was done in a primary school with kids from the Brahmin caste, the most prestigious, and a group of kids from the untouchables, from the lowest caste. And the test was a puzzle, very simple. And when the kids came into the classroom, the teacher welcomed them in the following way. Good morning, you all beautiful and intelligent children. We have a very simple test for you. Please sit down and take the test. And of course, both groups, the Brahmin and the untouchables, had the same result because, you know, intelligence is equally distributed among people. And then they did the same experiment with a small change. When the kids came into the classroom, two different groups, they welcomed them in the following manner. Good morning, you children from the Brahmin class. Please come to the front. You, the children of the untouchables, you sit in the back. That was the only difference. The test was the same. Look at the results. Difference significantly, statistically significant. The mere fact of reminding the children where they belonged in society undermined their self-esteem. And if you think about some of the experience you may have seen in your school days, sometimes teachers behave in the same way. So motivation is important, and information. If you don't think, if you don't know about opportunities, and if you don't think that it is for you, you will self-select yourself out of school. There was an interesting study recently in London where they saw that these kids from low-income families who had perfect A-level were going to a college of further education, that's a vocational training institution. And the irony is that every day they drove in front of Imperial College, this top engineering school, and they had the grades to enter there. But they had no clue on that it was open to them, that it could be an opportunity for them. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about equity promotion policies. At the national level, it is important to combine both financial aid and non-financial interventions. Money is important, of course, so you want to make sure that no academically qualified students will be denied access for financial reasons. So it's very important to put in place good, well-managed, well-targeted systems, then can be help overcome the financial barriers. And in some countries, it's not easy. I remember in my own country, everybody had a scholarship because the ministry's reasoning was that, in some countries, if you come from a rich family or from a powerful family, you have so-called interventions to make sure that your children will have access to these privileges. So by making the scholarships universal, they assume that at least the poor will also get them, right? Not only the rich. So there is a lot of experience on need-based grants. In the US, you have a so-called Pell grants that have been very instrumental. You can have work grants, tuition discounts, and then student loans that exist now in more than 70 countries. They come in different shapes, mortgage-type loans where you repay a fixed sum until you have repaid, or the income contingent loans following the model of Australia, New Zealand, where you pay back a fixed percentage of your income. And that's a very nice system because it's both fair. If I'm unemployed, I don't have to pay back. If I'm a mother and I take time off from work, I'm not being penalized. If I'm socially inclined, I want to work for an NGO, I'm not penalized. And if I'm a rich lawyer in an engineer, I will pay more back to society. And because it's administered through either to the income tax or to the social security system, it's also very efficient. There is no leakage possible. In fact, you may have read this week that one of the problems the Australians had is that many Australians migrate abroad and then they would not pay back their loan, and now they have fixed that. So it's leak proof. So it must be well targeted and well administered. And since I want to talk again about Chile, because Chile is a fascinating place because they tried many different financial instruments. And I don't want to expect you to understand the complexity of this graph, but just tell you that the government in Chile gives money to universities either directly or direct grants, as would happen here in Luxembourg, but through the scholarships, and they also have vouchers and they have student loans, they give money indirectly. They give them to the students, and then it goes indirectly to the universities. Now, what is interesting is that when you look at who benefits by quintile, from the poorest to the richest, direct funding to the university, because the proportion of rich students is higher, benefits rich students more. Whereas indirect funding that goes directly targeted to the poorer students, will be much more progressive. So that's why you see that the share here for these two instruments is much higher. And then you have the non-financial measures. You want to make sure that you give opportunities to those students who have potential but who may not be interested, may not be motivated, may not be prepared, may not be informed. So through academic and career counseling, so-called outreach, bridge programs, many universities in the US, for example, but in Spain as well, and a few other European countries, have programs where they go to high schools to try to motivate and prepare underprivileged students. And then there are systems to reform selection procedures or preferential admission programs. You may be aware of the Sciences Po program in France, for example, to bring students from the underprivileged outskirts of French cities. Or in some cases, special institutions and programs targeting underprivileged groups. In New Zealand, for example, there is a university for the Maori students that has been quite successful. Canada has some universities for the Inuit. And then retention programs to improve completion rates. Again, it's not only a question of bringing students at risk into universities, but also making sure that they stay there. a few examples. University of Almeria in Spain has a join us in your university program. Victoria University in the outskirts of Melbourne has an access and success program. And then the issue of trying to motivate young people for science. German universities go into kindergartens to try to motivate kids to look at engineering education as something important. And affirmative action programs, that's where you change a little bit the admission criteria for minority students. Very common in US, India, Brazil, some programs in France. Malaysia is the country that has a large-scale affirmative action program for the Malay part of the population. And experience showed that these programs work best when it's also when you accompany the students with proper academic monitoring and support, because sometimes they are at risk and they need help. Same thing at the institutional level. Many institutions have their own financial aid program and their interventions to make sure that students stay. University of Texas in El Paso, that has a high majority of a high proportion of Mexican students. I work with a Colombian university called Uniminuto. They have what they called the first year vice rector, because they realize that most of the dropouts happen during the first year because the transition is just too much for the students, they're not ready. So they have a special program to monitor them and to be able to intervene and help them before they drop out. Or making sure that you are ready also for your students with disability or special needs. This is a special computer for students who are almost blind, not completely blind, with touch, tactile touch. That's, I think I took this picture at the University of Cyprus. In conclusion, when we think about mankind, we are all different. And that's what makes being a human being fun. But what is bad is when education starts treating us differently because we look different. This is another illustration of this, Underneath, we all look the same, right? Or look at this cute picture. The kid on the left asks, "Did you stay too long and get burned?" And the kid on the right answers, "No, just the normal time, 9 months." "And you, what happened to you? Did they take you out and cooked?" Today, unfortunately, when we look at higher education, you have a few winners, many losers. And if you think about it, it's like traveling. Yeah? First, you need a passport. You need to graduate from high school. Then, for many countries, you need a visa. You need to get into a higher education institution. And then, depending on what kind of institution you get into, what kind of degree you get at the end, you will have a more or less comfortable journey. And one issue we have to look at is the tension between excellence and equity. Many countries now talk about world-class universities, have excellence initiatives, and that sometimes may be prejudicial to equity. For example, the rankings in the US are much more favorable, take into consideration the level of selectivity, which is linked to your socioeconomic origin, rather than efficacy, which is the ability to keep students regardless of how well they were prepared. With the financial crisis in the US, we see now a shift towards more merit-based scholarships rather than need-based. And in the UK, the probability of going to beautiful Oxford or beautiful Cambridge is 55 times higher if you come from a private high school than if you come from a public high school in a rich country like Great Britain. There is a book that some of you may have read, which is called The Spirit Level, that looks at inequity in many walks of life. And this, I think this graph summarizes very well, looking at social mobility and income inequality. So 2 countries, UK and USA, that have the highest ranked universities, whether we're talking about the Times Higher Education or the Shanghai ranking, they are much more unequal than societies like the Nordic countries or even Canada and Germany that may not have that many universities in the top rankings, although they're still doing well relatively to population, but they are much more democratic in terms of education opportunities. I like Richard Torney's quote, because I think it captures it well. Equality of opportunity is the impertinent courtesy of an invitation offered to unwelcome guests, in the certainty that circumstances will prevent them from accepting. And just to finish, I think, none of us likes to live in a world like the one described by George Orwell in Animal Farm. You may, if you read that book, you may remember that quote where he says, "We are all equal, but some of us are more equal than the others."